Hello guys, today I'm going to show you how to create a land protection plugin for Bukkit. This topic can get very complex very quickly, so we are going to be covering the basics today. I have a command named claim that is going to allow players to claim chunks that they are standing in, and they can claim an unlimited amount of chunks, and any other players that are on the server will not be able to build in these areas. So let's go ahead and begin. I've gone ahead and created a class for our claim command already. The first thing we want to do inside of this method is make sure that the sender is an instance of a player. And then we want to create an object to hold our player. Since our plugin is for claiming an entire chunk, we can go ahead and get the chunk that the player is standing in by getting the player's location. And then we can use that to see if the player is inside of a chunk that has already been claimed or not. While we could save all of the chunks to memory, I think a much better way of doing this is to create an ID for each chunk and then save that ID to memory instead of holding the entire chunk object. And on top of that, we won't have to worry about refreshing the chunk instances when the server loads. So let's go ahead and create an ID for our chunk here. It's going to be a string, and I'm going to name this chunk ID. And the ID of a chunk is going to first contain the chunk's x coordinate, followed by a separator of sorts. I recommend using a period because that character is supported on all operating systems. And then the second thing we're going to put in here is the z coordinate. And then that is going to be our chunk ID for identifying unique chunks, because every chunk has its own x and z coordinate. Now the next thing we want to do is make a way for us to save all of these chunks that we are claiming into memory. I'm going to go ahead on over to our main class here, and I am going to be creating a hash map that is going to first contain the key, which is going to be our chunk ID, and then the value for that key is going to be the UUID for the player who claimed the chunk. If you want multiple players to have access to a single chunk, you will need to come up with some sort of system for handling that. You can do it simply by changing the one UUID in this hash map to a list of UUIDs, but then you won't have any way of determining who is the owner, so you will have to do something else in that regard. We are not going to be covering those things in today's topic. We are going to be keeping it very simple, so every chunk is linked to a single player. So inside of our onEnable, we need to make sure to initialize this hash map, or else we will get some errors. And then I'm going to make a few methods here for interacting with this hash map. The first is going to be a method for adding chunks into this hash map. The second is going to be a boolean for whether or not a chunk is inside of this hash map. And the third is going to be a method for getting the owner of a specified chunk. Now that we have all three of those methods created, we can hop back over to our command class and get started using them. First thing we're going to do here is see if this chunk ID is already inside of that hash map we just defined. Whenever this runs, we want to send the player a message letting them know that this chunk is already claimed. And if the chunk is not claimed, we want to add the player and the chunk to our hash map. So that is all of the code for claiming our chunks done. Now we're going to be heading over to our listener class, where we can detect to see if any players are trying to build or interact with blocks inside of a claimed chunk. So the event we are going to be listening for today is the player interact event. And the first thing we want to do inside of this event is make sure that the block the player is clicking is not equal to null. If this is true, then that means the player has clicked the block, and we want to prevent that if they do not own the chunk. I'm going to create a chunk ID for the chunk the same way we did in the command class. And now, just like we did in the last class, we want to check to see if this chunk is claimed. And I'm going to go ahead and create a variable for our player here. And then if the chunk is claimed, we want to check to see if the player is the owner of the chunk or not. And then inside of here, I'm going to make it so that any OP players are allowed to break any blocks inside of any chunks they want to. So I'm going to check to see if the player is not OP. And if they're not OP and they're also not the owner, we're going to cancel the event, and we're going to send them a message letting them know that they are not allowed to build in the chunk. If you want to do things like add prevention for damaging mobs or other things inside of a chunk, you can go ahead and do that as well. We are only going to be focusing on interacting with the blocks in this episode. So that's all the code done. I'll go ahead and hop on in game here and show you guys that it works. Alright, so now we are in game. If I go ahead and claim this chunk that I am standing in, you will see I get a message maybe. Did I send a message? No, I forgot to send a message to the player letting them know that they claimed a chunk, but I did in fact claim the chunk, And if I go ahead and try to build here, you will see I get a message saying I am not allowed to build here. And if I try to claim the same chunk again with this other character, you will see it says the chunk is already claimed. And if I fly out here, claim this chunk, or that's the same chunk actually, claim this chunk, and find that player, and I break a block with this character who is OP, you will see it lets me break any block I want to. So if you're an admin, you can bypass any build protection. Thanks so much for watching. If this video helped you out, make sure to leave a like. If you ran into any issues, head on over to my Discord server to get some help. Anyways, that's all for today. I will see you next time. Goodbye.
Nice! The mutt's nuts, in fact.